Thank you so much. So my name is Bryce Barrows, and I am the China Affairs Analyst at the Alliance for Security and Democracy program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone tonight to our event on U.S.-China relations, which is Diversity in National Security Network, U.S.-China Relations Perspectives. So this evening, I think what makes this great is all the participants here, myself included, happen to be very deeply involved in working on diversity issues within the US, China, or just within the China field broadly. And having those perspectives and also ensuring that there are more people that look like us in this field is really a value add to this panel tonight. It's also worth noting that anything I say is a personal opinion of mine. It does not reflect the opinions or the stances of my employer. And I'm sure that other individuals that are here as well could say the same. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists. Our first panelist, her name is Charlie Hargis. She's a non-resident fellow at Taiwan Next Gen Foundation. She is also a contributor to the China Watcher newsletter at Politico, and she is a senior advisor on China to the Oxford Diplomatic Society. Shirley, can you speak a little bit more about your background?
Of course, thank you. Thank you, Bryce. And I co-sign that bit about any opinion that I share not having any reflection on my employer. So again, my name is Shirley Marty Hargis. I bring over a decade of experience in China and Taiwan's foreign relations and domestic politics. I've lived on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. I have professional level proficiency in Chinese, native fluency in 3 African languages, and unique regional versatility that includes Russia, Latin America, and the continent of Africa and China affairs. Basically my focus is based on my perspectives and my positioning based on my lived experiences. I'm able to provide distinctive perspectives about the complex political, economic, security, and social trends that impact the US and global affairs. I am an affiliated expert serving as lead China strategist for CRDF Global's China programming. Prior to my current role, I spearheaded CRDF Global's new China programs on the Countering PRC Acquisition and Misuse of Weaponizable Tech and Talent team, directing a team to provide solutions to the Department of State to support US allies while serving as the principal point of contact. As Bryce also mentioned, I'm a non-resident fellow at Taiwan Next Gen Foundation. Among my publications is I believe June, I guest hosted Politico's China Watcher. I provided support to the ICDOD and federal law enforcement communities to protect national security. And earlier on in my career, I produced political, economic, and security related risk assessments to domestic and international consulting firms, including projects for the DOS, defense agencies, and academic institutions. I'm a DC chapter Truman National Security Fellow, a member of the American Association for Chinese Studies, the Black China Caucus, Black Professionals in International Affairs, and Foreign Policy for America.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that, Shirley. We really appreciate it. So next we're going to move on to our next panelist, Rashid Griffith. So Rashid is a non-resident senior fellow with the Asia Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Rashid, can you please speak a little bit to your biography and your interest in this panel?
Sure. So I primarily work in the financial industry in the currency landscape in North America. I also do for a company. I'm a head of operations and compliance, and we deal quite a lot with Chinese clients as well. I lived and worked in the Caribbean, North America, and Southeast Asia, in particular China, Philippines, and New York, and Toronto, and so on. I have a very big interest in Caribbean offshore finance, in market making strategies, and using financial innovation for general industry development. My interest in China came through the financial aspects. Of course, Shanghai, Pudong area is a very interesting coming up financial hub for the world, obviously Hong Kong as well. And I started there and then branched out into how China is looking at the Caribbean and Latin America, and then the Americas more generally. As Bryce mentioned, I am a senior fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue. I am also I write fairly often about China, Latin America, the Caribbean topics in the Jamestown Foundation, Diplomat, Foreign Affairs, and so on. And I am very much looking forward to having a conversation with everyone here on the panel.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Rashid. And last but not least, Ms. Ann Lister-Rudd, who happens to be the Senior Asia Analyst at CRE Labs. Can you please share a little bit about your biography and some of the work that you do in this field?
Yes, thank you, Bryce. And also want to iterate what an honor it is to be on a panel here with Rashid and with Shirley. And also to echo statements made by everyone else so far. My comments reflect my own opinions and don't reflect any of the stances or opinions of my employer, CRE Analytics. So my name is Ann Listrud. I'm Senior Asia Analyst for a private consulting firm that focuses on open source records, particularly when it pertains to corporate records and being able to track corporate networks. My work tends to focus on China. I focus on state-owned enterprises in particular, as well as China's industrial policy and how it relates to current and evolving US regulations towards investment and trade with China. Before my current work, I've worked a couple different places in DC. I used to work for the US-China Economic Security Review Commission, which is a nonpartisan congressional commission that does research and submits a report annually to Congress on the state of the US-China relationship and key areas of focus that, that US lawmakers should consider in the coming year forward. I also used to work for Trivium China, another private consulting outfit, best well known for its daily tip sheet, where their analysts provide information and context on China's ongoing policy changes on China markets and how Chinese political economy could affect business in particular. I've also used to work for Party Watch Initiative out of the Center of Advanced China Research. Party Watch Initiative focuses on creating a resource for English speakers making state-owned media outlets from China and their messaging accessible to English researchers and an English-speaking audience in order to create greater transparency on the kinds of messaging coming out of particularly People's Daily, but more generally out of China's state-run media. Before my work in DC, I used to work for Industrial Bank of Japan Leasing in Tokyo, where I translated leasing legal documentation from Japanese to English on behalf of their international business department. I speak and read Mandarin Chinese as well as Japanese. My interest in China came a little bit roundaboutly. I was very interested in Korea and Japan, particularly my freshman year of college. But as I continued taking classes about East Asia political economies, the role of China was very prominent. And a lot of the questions that I found really fascinating about the role of authoritarianism and the role of authoritarianism in the economy and the social trade-off that societies make between control and economic development were really fascinating. There are similar questions you can make with history of other regions, including South Korea in particular. But that was one of the questions that really drove my interest and made me interested in learning more about China. I taught English in China for 3 years right after graduating, so built up a lot of my fluency there, built a lot of social connections there as well. Very, very excited to talk here with this panel and talk about US-China relations and how we can study it. Oh,
right.
also, sorry, I almost forgot.
No, please go ahead.
Sorry, almost forgot to mention also, I'm part of the leadership board for LACHNet, the Latinx China Network. Rashid is a member we're very proud of in this network. Yeah, as of this spring, I've been part of our leadership board and spearheading a lot of our efforts for external events in particular, and hope everyone here can keep an eye out for our agenda next year as we pin that down. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and I want to take a second just to highlight the efforts of Black China Caucus, and LatChinet. They've done a wonderful job of trying to advocate for more diverse voices within this space and have really tried to do the best that they can to build up databases for Latinx and Caribbean, as well as individuals that identify as Black or African within this space. I think that's huge. I could personally say that it's definitely made my career a lot easier, as well as Rashid, Shirley, and obviously the work that Anne does with LatChinet has been fabulous. So, a couple of you already touched on is how you got into this field, but I don't think we got a chance to really hear about that from Shirley. Shirley, can you talk a little bit about what made you want to get into the China field and what sparked your interest initially?
Well, goodness, I'll be honest. It started with the Kung Fu movies when I was a kid. And I watched them often with my dad. But of course, at that time, I had no, other than outside of some, really liking Japanese pop culture, I had no, I had no thoughts of getting to where I am right now. But it all started over a decade ago in East Asia and World Affairs course. And that's where I learned, my parents are from Ghana. So that's where I learned about the China-Africa relationship. And it was fascinating to me. I'd never heard about it. And I was just so interested in it. So I'm in this class, and I would say what really started it was a project on inter-Korean relations. I was measuring four U.S. administrations and for South Korean administrations, and observing their approach to the Sunshine Policy. So sometimes it's amazing. I don't know Korean or something like that, but it was a very interesting project. So from there, I started. There were country projects in relation to China. Was learning more about China, Africa, and just a lot of different types of relationships. And I would say also that my first exposure to Taiwan was also in this course. My first time abroad was in Taiwan, my first immersive, intensive language environment. And so that is one of the bigger reasons why I am still so connected in cross-strait relations, US-China, and so interested in China affairs in the Indo-Pacific. Moving along from there, I enjoyed learning. I enjoyed learning Mandarin, especially writing the characters, and being able to live and work in China, Taiwan, and just being able to travel back and forth. It was really a great way to look at, just kind of view myself outside of what I'm used to in the US. So I think those growing pains and those opportunities to just have more wisdom. We can never, there's nothing wrong with more wisdom. Really came from my time living so far out of the box in China and Taiwan, and learning myself through those cultures, making lifelong bonds.
That's awesome. And it's interesting how that sort of comes about, and when you don't expect that too, especially when you get into this field. Rashid, is there anything else you would like to add to how you sort of got involved in China as well?
No.
Perfect. So moving on to our second question for everybody, and please feel free to answer this. There's been a lot of talk about the nomenclature that should be used to describe the U.S.-China relationship. Obviously, it ranges from strategic competition to great power competition to even the phrase "a new Cold War." So based off your experiences, and Rashid, I apologize, I know you're not a U.S. citizen, but keeping the spirit of Pan-American cooperation, you are an American in that sense. So we highlight it as such. What sort of relationship do you think the United States should have with China? And that's for everybody, all around the panel.
Well, from my background in Chinese military logistics, just from that aspect, I understand why a lot of folks we can classify as hawks. I understand that. I understand the caution we have to have with Chinese military civilian fusion, especially with this decoupling with science, with technology, of course. I do think that while we should be mindful of those arenas, I don't think we should cancel out entirely what I don't think we should not ask ourselves what would coexistence also look like, because it seems as though we have so many red lines in the sand right now with China. Of course, we see through the headlines. It's it's always very tense, just reminding us of tension with China. But personally, I think the Anchorage summit was a performance. That's my personal opinion. I think it was a performance, and I would not be surprised if behind the scenes some conversations are being had. Of course, we cannot overlook the challenge with Taiwan. We can't overlook China's reach in the Indo-Pacific and how we are trying to, strengthen our relationships with allies as a result of the damage from the last couple years. But I do think that we can't just say, dismiss China entirely. I don't think there is a realistic way that we can make it us versus, I don't think there's a way that we can make it so that folks have to choose between the US or China in certain ways. China is always going to be impactful on the global stage. The US will be as well. So I think in some certain areas, trade, for example, we should be thinking about how we coexist. One thing I do want to say, if we're talking about, the military logistics aspect, when we look at Taiwan, where the discussion is always, will the US come in, will we protect Taiwan should anything happen? And I think that's very important for us to ask that question. In addition, we should also be asking, what does China have to gain from taking Taiwan? On the surface, it just seems, oh, why not? Well, they did this and this with Hong Kong. It would be easy, but if we look at the history between, if we look at the economic history between mainland and Taiwan, there's so much that it would be a massive economic disadvantage for China to take Taiwan and interrupt the the relations across the strait economically. We can look at the tech aspect. There are a lot of aspects that we should be considering as well, rather than just China's going to take Taiwan next week or something like that, because that's how the headlines are reading. That's how a lot of folks are speaking about Taiwan. And so that is one point I do want to make about the US-China relationship and how we should be maybe expanding our scope in terms of what this could look like down the line.
So keeping that in mind, Anne, what do you think would be a good way to sort of frame what US-China relations are, and recognizing that in the transition from the Trump to Biden administrations, even there's been a discussion about what's the preferred nomenclature?
Yes, certainly. I'm very cautious when people start using the term New Cold War. I think just given the nature of the modern world today is just so radically different from the first Cold War. If for no other reason, just the fluid motion of people that we're used to existing between our countries for decades now. I think every single one of us knows at least a few Chinese citizens from having gone to school, even if one has not set foot in China itself, much less those of us who have spent time traveling or living in China and getting to know people that way. And in my mind, one of the most dangerous aspects of our current moment is even before COVID became a global pandemic, just how much of these interpersonal relationships were drying up and the barriers being put in place for, say, students applying for visas to the United States, or cross-national academic conferences, for example. These aren't necessarily the people, the highest level decision makers, but they do influence how our nations view each other and how that overall information about one another's countries disseminates, and it humanizes us. Also, as opposed to during the Cold War, my professional focus has been trade and economics. Our two economies are both so integrated with one another directly and with the world at large. And one aspect of being part of a global economy is that even if you are not directly trading with a country that, say, you've decided you have a strategic rivalry, if you want to frame it that way, your interactions in the global marketplace are still having an impact on one another, even if it's indirectly by a third-party customer or third-party seller. China, the United States, I live here in DC, like I think some of us on this call do, and there's a lot of focus on how difficult it is for a lot of US supply chains to try to move away from China for a variety of reasons. China is also similarly figuring out that they're having difficulty replacing their own supply chains with things like Australian coal, for example. Chinese leadership back last year was very happy to sort of push their weight around, quote unquote, in terms of Australia because Australian leaders were pushing for investigation into Wuhan. In response, there were some very kind of under the table retaliatory measures, including against Australian commodities. And it has certainly hurt Australian sellers, but it's also hurt the Chinese people who are now, some of them don't have access to coal as it's getting colder. That's maybe an oversimplification of what that story looks like, but I think it kind of shows the lie to the myth, which is certainly popular around DC, that China is in a position of economic power to the point where it does not matter what they do to smaller actors. That's just not true. That economic power, certainly, it's not a small thing, but it's not a cannon you can load like a regular weapon and fire off. It has effects on your own population when you cut off these tracks of trade. So in terms of nomenclature for what to use, looking at our relationship going forward, I think right now we are, coexistence is not just a choice, it is a fact of reality. There isn't really a fast, effective way, even if one wanted to do this, and I would not advocate this personally, of just eradicating the Chinese system as it exists today. That's just not going to happen, regardless of you think that's a good idea or not. I personally don't think it's a good idea to do that, but that aside, if we want to live in this reality and think about what are we going to do next year, tomorrow, next month, so on and so forth, we need to think about how to coexist, because that's the reality we're faced with. And do we want to have a plan for that, or do we want to passively be reactive to it?
I think it's a really good way of framing that, and it also provides a lot of context for a lot of the different work that Rashid does. Rashid is currently based in Panama City, Panama, and he is a citizen of Barbados. And a lot of the research that he looks at is China's involvement in Latin America and the Caribbean. So Anne talked a little bit about small countries. Rashid, can you provide a little bit of context for how smaller countries within the Western Hemisphere, outside of Canada and the United States, might look at the U.S.-China relationship and what advantages and disadvantages they might see from that?
So just by, I guess, default, the question about US, China is always phrased in a weird category error. We're asking, is it this or this or this or this? But as Anne pointed out and Shirley pointed out, it's no point even asking that question in some sense. For example, General Motors sells more cars in China than in the US. Apple's huge chunk of Apple's wealth is in Chinese buyers' hands. US investors have a 700 billion exposure to Chinese equities. China has 1.1 trillion US debt. Like, there's no way to have a conversation about some kind of potential disentangle, potential anything like that, because there's no way for the US to exist without China as it is getting bigger and so on. But that in itself is the problem, because from the outside, looking into US politics and US rhetoric on China, it just seems to me that there is a lot of scapegoating going on, and using China as a scapegoat to subsidize their own bad way of looking at economic growth or social progress, something like that, where, let's not talk about how we could have changed our own policies to help the Midwest. Let's say China deindustrialized the Midwest. And in terms of small countries around the US, these problems that when you say things like that, we hear it and see it and we're like, oh, well, you're not actually serious about what you're saying. And therefore, your itself is not when you say other things. You have that cascading effect. That's a very toxic effect that perpetually goes on without any kind of abatement. And the reality is that, of course, because of the countries close by, even if, and then since this is a weird thought experiment, even if the US itself wanted to disentangle from China, even knowing how bad it'll be, the US cannot therefore disentangle from the Americas because, Mexico is a huge trading partner of China. So is Canada. A big chunk of the US states themselves have China as the biggest trading partner. Most of Latin America, Brazil, Chile, going down the line, in the Caribbean, for example, a lot of technology, a lot of the food and the groceries all come from not food, but groceries come from China. So the Americas cannot be isolated from China, and the US itself cannot therefore be isolated from the Americas and therefore from China. So it's very, very tricky when I hear a lot of, particularly DC or state or other people talk about any idea of nuclear war and this and that. It just shows you how you are generally lazy analysis, to put it very frankly, and you don't want to actually put in the work to think about how do we change things that we can change and not abrogate responsibility to have a better economy, a better society that in itself would therefore help more American progress, because you can't think about competition with China as simply trying to contain China. That is not even a real concept. So if all you're saying is let's think about the ways to contain or compete with China, you're not saying anything at all. So what does it say about the US foreign policy when in reality it's nothing at all about anything else? I think in the Americas, that's what we're looking at a lot more these days.
So to provide more context for Rashid was just what he was just saying, anecdotally, when I was living in Shanghai, I'm Jewish, a member of the Shanghai Jewish community that I was good friends with is Mexican, and he made a lot of money helping Mexican companies reshore their efforts from working inside the United States to working in China, given some of the rhetoric that the Trump administration had, not only about NAFTA, which is now USMECA, but also just in general, given uncertainties about the U.S. market. So Rashid was spot on with that. So moving on to the next question, and I think sort of framing this from a U.S. perspective, once again, is a little bit of a folly. But can the three of you, and whoever wants to go first, please do, please describe how U.S.-China relations, affects the everyday U.S. citizen, or in Rashid's case, how that may or may not impact someone who's a citizen of a small country within the Caribbean or elsewhere in the Americas.
I'm also, that's a great question. I'm also very interested in hearing what Anne and Rashid have to say, because I know Anne mentioned her trade background. Looking at this the trade war, this trade war and the tariffs and et cetera, and we know that cost of production in China is much cheaper, significantly cheaper. The quality is good too. Logically, why would an American company that wants to break into the Chinese market choose to come to the US only if the cost of production is significantly higher here, and sometimes there's some questionability, there's some, the quality can be is not as competitive as it is in China with certain things. It's like, for example, let's say let's say in China, there's a company that creates the body of a lawnmower, for example, but they get the actual motor from the US. But if these tariffs are high, this Chinese company can explore other markets. They don't have to, their only option is not the US. So when I think about trade, I want Americans to think about that part too. China doesn't have to deal with us all the time. They can take their market elsewhere to other countries. And so I would love to hear what Anne thinks about that, because I do think that aspect affects Americans, and cybersecurity, but I don't want to get too deeply into that. But I do think, I'll just quickly say that I think it is important that the Biden administration has been focusing also on cybersecurity, because we do need to talk about how that's affecting your everyday American. Before they started focusing on cybersecurity, it was, I wish I could remember the percentage, but the amount of reports to the FBI on cybersecurity, the amount that was actually being addressed and solved, ridiculously low, not kind of sort of low, very low. And so so I know the administration is trying to focus on cybersecurity, protecting Americans against that. But I do think one of the big things we have to talk about when it comes to affecting Americans is certainly the trade aspect. Very interesting hearing what Anne has to say about that.
Thank you, Shirley, because the thing that came to mind for me was trade. Oh goodness. This was some time ago, but I remember I was a freshman in college and I had a classmate who was an exchange student from China. And I invited her over to spend Christmas with my family. And my mom was very thoughtful, and she wanted to get my friend a Christmas present that was not made in China. And she struggled to find anything. I think she did eventually find something that was made by like a local artist in the city we lived in. But just as an anecdote there, as a cute anecdote there, it was very difficult for my mother to find things that were not made in China. And today also, it's difficult to find things. I in terms of like the role of global supply chains and how we're integrated with China's manufacturing. And as Shirley pointed out, it isn't necessarily a one-way street. There's also a great deal of goods that are sent by the US and then assembled in China. There's goods that are used in the process of creating something, and the final manufacturing stage or the final value added stage might be in the United States, but maybe the processing or extraction comes from China. And tariffs, one thing we saw, particularly with like aluminum tariffs, was how a lot of the end stage manufacturing, where a lot of that value added comes from, that was supplying US manufacturers, was suddenly cut off because they were not able to access their prior sources, and the difficulty that came with that. And yet, even despite this, the thing that really amazes me the most, and I find really interesting to look at, is how even after everything in the trade war, we still have the degree of economic integration that we do when it comes to manufacturing, which manufacturing, again, is just focusing on, just one aspect of our economy. And the idea that we could, suddenly flip a switch and turn that off really shocks me, because although now the focus is on China, that role in global supply chains, that didn't start with US economic relations with China. It started with US economic relations with Japan, and it spread to South Korea and Taiwan, and different aspects of that supply chain feed made their way to China. And some of those aspects also are starting to go to places like Vietnam and India and Indonesia. But this is a supply chain issue that in some form or another has existed since the end of World War II, essentially, very, very shortly after the Korean War, I want to say the 1950s, we start seeing this this pattern of the United States manufacturing sector being supplied via a global supply chain, and US consumers being supplied by, again, that global manufacturing chain. And that's before you even get into NAFTA, which is, again, one of the major manufacturing powerhouses of the world. So we as American citizens, and this is part of what I find so interesting and exciting about studying trade, every one of us, from the clothes we wear to, you know, the implements we're eating, even the food and drinks itself, we are interacting with objects that have been created by people all around the world. And understanding that relationship that we have, that they have, and how these things got here. A, I think it's really interesting, and B, it helps me feel connected to the world, and C, it helps us kind of think about what do we want those relationships in the world to look like in the future, more so than just global, you know, national relations, but, you know, on a more deep level about, you know, how we value work and what kind of work goes into things. So, and yeah, I think the other major aspect is just how we interact, particularly with students. But that I realize also I've talked for a bit, so I want to also cede the floor, and I'd be very interested to hear Rashid's thought on this topic.
So the impact of trade war between US and China has this secondary effect on small countries that, you know, for all these reasons, it's not discussed. Caribbean countries, for example, are import economies by default. This is not a problem, this is just how the countries run themselves. Now, if you're an import economy and you have to import from X place, now in Caribbean, because of different trade route, if you can mute your mics if you're not speaking, that'd be awesome. If you have trade routes that go through the US, although they come from China with the US, what happens when all your stuff now comes more expensive because the place where you're essentially transshipping from has the tariffs put onto them, and therefore come Caribbean after that. So when the US has tariffs on Chinese goods, the Caribbean has tariffs on Chinese goods. That's obviously a problem because unlike the US, there's no ability of doing import substitution. There's no, for example, I don't know, Trinidadian iPhone maker, whatever, or, you know, Trinidadian, you know, cups and so on and so forth. Those things have to come from the US. Now, here's the rub. If it's the case that Caribbean countries consistently realize that they may have to pay higher and higher prices for goods from China because they come from Miami in most cases, and they can't really always pass on these prices to Caribbean people because of, you know, excessive costs. What are they going to do? They're going to find alternative mechanisms to get those goods from China. If this happens on a big scale, when trade is rerouted from Miami and New York to the Caribbean, from, let's say, Shanghai, Guangzhou to Panama to Caribbean, the impact that has now on the links between the Caribbean and China is obviously quite, Caribbean, US is quite substantial. When you have the Europe, it's actually, you know, this backyard statement, US always still be Caribbean, there's some, you know, issues there, but it has that, it's still true in some sense. When your backyard is not entangled that much in your own economy, what would happen if that backyard becomes hostile? So there is this, you know, common thing in geopolitics in U.S. foreign policy for a long time, where the Caribbean is the garage door to the U.S. because even as simple as getting goods from L.A. to New York is cheaper if you go through the Panama Canal up the Caribbean to the Gulf and down to New York. What happens when those seaways aren't as, you know, open to you as they would be before? That's the same old problem from the last 200 years, 100 years or so. That's still a problem now. And I think when you have these very trite domestic squabbles in the US, they don't always think about the foreign policy implications, of course, but the problem is that people outside the US also have to think about those implications. And when it comes to trade, it's not just US person's impact, it's that impact plus a magnified impact from people near the US that have to get transshipped around. So it's a fairly substantial impact. And I think that is perhaps one of the most tangible frictions a lot of Caribbean governments think about the US now. Of course, the technology is a big issue as well. So that kind of comes in there, where, for example, you hear a lot of the, recently, a year ago, a couple years ago, I think last year, the US ambassador to Jamaica, he gave like a public statement where he said, oh, you know, because we got the Huawei 5G, if a hurricane come and destroy Jamaica, we may not give you foreign aid, you know, things like that. So you can't really walk that back in some sense. But in reality is that, you know, Huawei has been in Caribbean for many, 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 many years. Most of the telecom infrastructure in Barbados, for example, even the household OTNs are made in China, Huawei. And you can't roll it back. So those kind of topics where you think about the impact of the US, of course, is very important. But the impact the US then has on the Caribbean, Latin America, filters back to how the US is treated by these countries. And I think if that is taken more seriously, it'll be even more difficult to talk about any kind of, like, you know, disentanglement, for example.
Interesting that you bring up the ambassador example with Jamaica, because that had a huge falling out in Jamaica, and definitely did not strike the right chord that it was intended to, which is part of the, you know, responsibility of knowing the audience that you're communicating to. So I think, speaking to that, can you talk a little bit about, can all three of you talk a little bit about where do you see the future of U.S.-China relations sort of moving towards? Do you see it potentially having a negative impact on the layman U.S. citizen American, or having a positive one? And I think a good way to frame this, since we're discussing small powers, is, in my position at GMF, obviously Taiwan's sort of relationship with Central and Eastern Europe has been very big lately. Thinking about how does a Lithuania or Slovakia or Czechia interact with Taiwan or versus China, recognizing that that's sort of like a different situation. Those countries are NATO, EU members. They already don't have a lot of investment from China to begin with, and China sort of squandered those relationships. But there's still a little bit of a, sort of way to sort of view how that impact could have, similar to what different nationals across the Americas would be, in the sense that China sort of over-delivered on several sort of telecoms communications projects and other sort of investments across Eastern Europe, which actually influenced Lithuania, Czechia, Polish, sort of populations to turn against China. So where do you see that future evolving with the U.S. and China, and how that would impact your layman American?
Not to keep harping on trade. That said, I really hope the tone around trade is going to change. Much to what Anne and Rashid has said about how it's so interconnected. Just the idea of dismissing China from the conversation about trade is entirely unrealistic. That's not going to happen. And so I hope that the conversation around trade changes, because if it doesn't, I think about all this talk about tariffs and just tariffs. But I think that President Tsai, USTR rep Tai, when she
Catherine
Tai, yes, please. I was thinking about Tsai Ing-wen. Catherine Tai, yes. I think that the reason when she gave her speech on where trade is going, I think she wrote also in Chinese on Twitter for the purpose of ensuring that the Chinese know that it's time for us to have a conversation about what's really going to happen here. That said, I also think that I also think that we need to pay attention to where this Cold War analogy, just where this is going to go. Because if we're framing it in the context of Cold War, what I see already there is fear, trying to connect it to something that we can relate to in some kind of way, make it familiar. When in reality, this, in my opinion, much of this is unprecedented. And I think it's going to be very important for us to be mindful of how we frame this, because Cold War means very tight, unmoving, no consideration, no room for the kind of discussions where this could move forward. Whereas we could see where we can nurture this. We can see where we can think about ways to solve so many of the challenges that we're facing right now. That said, I think the future of U.S.-China relations also has to, I think the U.S. has to be sure that they are they're premier when it comes to technology on the global stage, because a lot of the opposition that we're seeing with U.S.-China, they were the lead in 5G. Many of our big tech companies are based in China as well. They have stations in China. They're not going to come back to the U.S. The cost of production is what it is. There's a big market there, and they're not going to come back. They're not going to just pull out of that. So we really need to think about, okay, we need to minimize the Cold War talk and focus more on what can we do to make this situation that we're in, that we might have been 5 to 10 years late on, a better situation. Lastly, I would say that when it comes to emerging technology, dual use technologies, IP, and things like that, I know that China is trying to also address its IP challenges, and we should see how that carries out. I think we need to see how a lot of things carry out. I'm not saying that China's innocent across the board. I'm not trying to say that at all. Chinese military civilian fusion is a real thing. A lot of these things are real things. Thousand Talents, it's still a real thing. But we need to think about what kind of red lines we want to draw in the sand, because a lot of the time I think that we're speaking in such a way as if we are trying to change China, and that is a dead end. That's a waste of time. So we need to pick and choose what red line or where we want to draw in the sand, and see where the balance can be. Thank you.
So something you mentioned that I think is really helpful for framing. You talked a lot about how there's, at least within the policy rhetoric within DC, there's a lot of focus on this sort of, I don't want to say negative aspects of U.S.-China relations. I suppose there's a better word for that. But there's a lot of focus on, let's focus on China. It's sort of almost like a gut check for the United States, as if everything could sort of be attributed back to China. Right. Although there's plenty of positive things that could come out of U.S.-China relations as well that will also impact the American citizen better. I think also to that point, to what you were mentioning, the Cold War analogy doesn't hit as well, because that fails to recognize that the Cold War was fundamentally not just about military balance, alliances, and whatnot. It was also a popularity contest, one of which the United States was able to win handedly. Right. And China isn't helping itself in the popularity realm right now. So Rashid, kind of using it as like a leapfrog into the discussion that we had with the Jamaican ambassador, can you talk a little bit about what are some of the ways that China, U.S.-China relations you envision going forward, but also can you just answer the question, are there any sort of ways that China sort of undermines its own interests across Latin America?
So I start from this point. There is a major problem I see with U.S. treatment of China in their foreign policy, or in policy in general. Because if one of the things of obviously doing foreign policy is keeping allies and keeping friends and all that fun stuff. But there's a problem where the U.S. has a Rorschach test approach to foreign policy, where it too often sees what it wants to see and not sees what's there. And when you do that, you have a very weird policy framework you implement. So in reality, if you have a policy framework that is not based on ground truth, and you can simply quantify certain factoids and coherence along different path dimensions. If your policy does not cohere to reality, there's very little that can be said about the future utility of that policy. Right? Almost everything you hear about from the US in terms of China and Latin America or China and Caribbean is at best outdated, and at worst just literally incorrect. And obviously the aggressiveness that comes with that is quite peculiar. For example, you hear things, oh, Chinese company, even up to a couple of months ago, the Secretary of State made some comments in terms of China and Africa, where he said that, you got to be careful with Chinese firms because they only come and employ Chinese people. Now, at best interpretation, that's outdated. At one point, that was the case. In most cases now, they're like 80% African people are employed by Chinese firms. Now, who's at fault when he gets that wrong? Is it him? Of course not. That's not his job. But who's at fault? Well, it's the question. In the Caribbean, similar things come up. You just hear things that is saying Pompeo came to Jamaica, for example, talk about debt trap, diplomacy from China in the Caribbean. I have to ask him, did you know that most of Caribbean debt is to the World Bank, IMF, and US? Where even Jamaica has probably the biggest Chinese, probably less than 5% is Chinese debt. So again, very basic facts they get wrong. And in that sense, there's nothing, there's very little optimism one can have about the state of US foreign policy in terms of China. And then if we read, for example, the books and reports where you talk Biden administration China specialists, it's not particularly interesting either. And again, if you're not if you're not in the US, this is not a problem for you in terms of that sense. But if you are out of the US and you see these things being said constantly, you're kind of at pause because like, what are you going to do? Where if your quote unquote best ally is constantly giving wrong examples and wrong angles about your country, there's nothing, it's not very good you can say about that. And that itself causes friction because it's like, oh, let's not actually care what's happening in Colombia. Let's say what we want to say. Let's not care about how about Jamaica. Let's say what we want to say. How do you think the governments in those countries will think about the stance in the US? It's also not going to be positive. So the erosion of political space in the region is getting worse and worse over time. And there's literally no sign of any stoppage at this point in time. Even recent, for example, the Jake Sullivan and the Biden administration announced this new thing called so many initialism acronyms. I can't remember it. It's the small and less populist thing, the SALP one from January. Okay. Yeah. And in the Caribbean, like, okay, you hear these things all the time, but it's just nonsensical, empty stuff. You have these 3BW, Build Back Better World thing now. Again, it's just all rhetorical things. It's from the Caribbean perspective. If you say, okay, well, your Build Back Better World thing going to build some infrastructure in the Caribbean, okay, fine. But who is going to actually build the infrastructure? Because US firms can't even build a bridge in the US. So when you see things like that and you hear, oh, we have this big plan, yet even domestically you can't fix your own roads and bridges, there's no real optimism in that sense either. So I think people need to take these things a bit more seriously when it comes to how not only domestically but how it's perceived outside. And unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic about even the Washington, group of people, because at least in terms of China, Latin America, Caribbean things, that I read a lot. There's every report from all the news think tanks are very, very dull. And it shows a complete lack of awareness of what's happening in the region. And even something like, just from Taiwan, for example, like a lot of US's foreign policy in the Caribbean is somewhat tangential wrapped into Taiwan. It's my opinion that there will be no Taiwan allies in the Caribbean in 10 years, even though Taiwan's exceptionally good at diplomacy in the Caribbean, exceptionally good. But yet that won't be enough because just for boring economic reasons, it will go the same as Panama did in 2017.
Rashid, if I can throw in a question, because you said you mentioned a lot of interesting things. Okay. My question for you, especially from your positioning, do you, and maybe I know the answer to this, but do you think that the U.S. has the cultural competency to be dealing with all these regions and countries, etc., at all?
That's a good question. You see, essentially the U.S. itself, of course, has the cultural competency because these regions, for example, Haiti, the country, is not where Haitian culture is anymore. It's in New York, right? The best art from Haiti is from New York. The best artists are from New York. That is where Haitian culture is, really. And for a lot of the Caribbean countries, that's still the case as well. For a lot of Latin America, it's still the case as well. So of course the US does, but it's very interesting because that stuff does not filter up. This is actually a diversity problem in State Department. That cultural knowledge does not filter up into state. So all you have in state now is just people who are essentially white Americans, essentially, that don't really have that kind of cultural competency, and they don't think about these places as actual places. They're only black boxes of foreign policy action for the energy. So that is a really big problem the US can easily solve if it took diversity a bit more seriously.
Yeah, I'd like to agree with what Rashid's saying, and also especially taking the diversity issue and the line you had about American foreign policy as a Rorschach test. And Rashid was great at pointing out how US foreign policy and DC-based foreign policy uses the Rorschach test to ignore facts about China's relationship with the Caribbean. But we also do it to reflect on our own history of the Cold War. My family's from Chile. Chilean politics to this day is very dramatically shaped by the vestiges of almost 20, a little less than a 20-year dictatorship, which was backed by the CIA. In the early 70s, there was an assassination of the then very recently deposed government officials in the streets of Washington, D.C. And yet most foreign policy experts in the United States have no idea that this happened. Now, I don't know that necessarily Chile would, well, I mean, there's a lot one could say about what may or may not have happened to Chile otherwise, but the fact that the US backed that government left a lasting imprint on a number of people, including very literal psychological scars that came with mass arrests and frequent torture. And Chile gets a lot more attention compared to a lot of other parts of Latin America in terms of US involvement during the Cold War. South Korea had a similar relationship with their leader, Park Chung-hee, for example. And the vestiges of that, although we tend not to teach this in US classes on South Korean history, and we tend not to frame it when we describe South Korean politics in our news coverage, but you can see the vestiges of that, of the Park Chung-hee regime in modern South Korean politics. These historical remnants, they have remained and they affect people to this day. And so in addition to coming up with outdated facts about China's involvement in the Caribbean, as Rashid pointed out, you also have sometimes very high-level US policymakers speaking, I guess charitably, they are speaking out of benign ignorance, I guess, of asking why countries in Latin America are not openly embracing US leadership, completely ignoring that there can be very good reasons why leadership or just general populations might at least want to hesitate and really examine what that cooperation might mean. And I would say, unlike Rashid, I am not a Latin America specialist, and yet I have, I frankly get kind of upset sometimes the number of conversations I have in DC where just based on anecdotes that I hear from my own family, I end up coming out sounding like I am an expert. I'm not. I just have random stories being a second-gen American from this part of the world. And again, pointing back to, as Rashid very rightly pointed out, we have massive communities in the United States who were affected in one manner or another because of their nation of origin, or because of, again, that cross-personal interaction throughout generations. We do have plenty of people in the United States who understand this on a deep level, and yet we tend to favor all the way down to just the academic level in undergraduate schools in the United States. We tend to favor a certain narrative, and we tend to reward a certain narrative that oversimplifies what the Cold War was and why the US won it. And put it down to we won it as a popularity contest that was freely won without any acknowledgement of the quite literal blood that went into it. I think it's a myth that Americans tend to tell ourselves, and it makes us as a US culture feel more comfortable about it. But it's something that's harder to forget if you're part of these other parts of the world.
And just to emphasize something just actually brought up, Anne. So there's interesting, because there's a curious parallel between how like Chinese government's revisionism of recent past, because they're very recent past, and the US also revisionism of the recent past as well, as a bit outsourced to other countries. It's very curious. But one thing I want to highlight in particular to emphasize again the diversity point is Chinese foreign policy is very simple. It's very basic. It's about Chinese power and money in the world. And they try to align incentives in that sense. US foreign policy is a lot more complicated. It has its values and systems involved. The problem is now, if you have a values-laden foreign policy, and you deal with all these countries, and your way to structure values is so undiverse in how you think about the world and people, it will actually make your foreign policy worse. Because you put the framework to have values in the policy, but don't actually do the work to have diverse values to lead the actual foreign policy. And where in China, they don't try to do value policy, so Chinese people everywhere doing the same economic things, that's okay. The US can't go back to that anymore. So you have to go forward on the values level. And if you do that, you can only do that properly if you have that much more diverse value appreciation. And start with the Americas. It's close to home. It's easier to understand because there's so much America in it, that I think that would be one way to think about the advance of US foreign policy in the region more coherently.
So to the points that everybody brought up, I think, especially within the context of U.S.-China relations, just to kind of frame this all, I moved from Los Angeles to D.C. for this position a little bit more than a year ago. And something that's always sort of shocked me being a think taker is, one, how much individuals in D.C. don't recognize how much influence different cities in the United States could have on a region of the world just based off the diaspora communities that happen to exist there, but also a misunderstanding of how those cities or those communities, even in some cases, U.S. territories like Puerto Rico or Guam, could even be used to advance American interests for other sort of geostrategic reasons. And to the point that you were making, I think that's huge. Living in LA, first of all, because you're Chilean, my next door neighbor was Don Francisco's grandson in Los Angeles, famous Chilean. But part of the reason why he was able to be very sort of popular is because he, kind of lodged himself within the Latin American community here in the United States, in Miami and Los Angeles, for a show, Sabio Gigante, which is huge. One of the biggest shows across Latin America. You wouldn't even know that the show was mostly filmed outside of Chile, even though initially it started in Santiago de Chile, in the United States, which says a lot to the soft power that the United States has, and how those different sort of levers can be used when trying to, quote unquote, compete against China or other sort of powers or what have you. So I think we're coming towards the end. I want to open this up to the audience for any questions. Feel free to please throw them out in the chat. Yeah, Don Francisco from Sabio Gigante, his grandson was my neighbor. His name's Ilan Neumhauser, and he is a famous director in Chile. So, Any questions from the audience? Okay, since we don't have any more, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our panelists for providing your insights. I think this has been very helpful, especially when framing how U.S.-China relations does impact like the layman American, and also within that context, understanding that U.S.-China relations isn't just this sort of like grandiose, sort of like almost class of civilization, Samuel Huntington sort of struggle, but also has real impact on different communities around the world, many of whom the United States is blessed to have the privilege of having the majority of that diaspora call this country now home. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next event.
Could we all just hold on 1 second, please? 1 second. I think hold on 1 second, please.
Could I make a point?
Sure.
Okay. I think the conversation about diversity, Rashid, thank you for answering that question, because oftentimes, just being first generation American, growing up in a Ghanaian household, even though I was in the US, you know, parents come here and they're like, no, you're not. We're raising you in this culture, even though we're here. And just navigating DC and just hearing a lot of these politics and speaking to diversity, you know, oftentimes the US likes to say that we have all this diversity here, it's a melting pot. That said, if your country's not a reflection of the diversity and the different mindsets here, we might as well not even have the melting pot. We have to learn, and I don't know how this would happen, but we do have to learn how to use the diversity that we have here in the US, the mindsets, the different lived experiences. We have to learn how to use those.
And to that point too, I mean, I think, so I'm fifth generation Cape Verdean American, and anytime I go to a Cape Verdean organization and talk about just what's going on in Cape Verde, most Cape Verdeans in the United States live in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and it's where my family immigrated to. Oftentimes, people don't even know I'm a China specialist. I'll talk to like an old Cape Verdean sort of like elder, and the first thing they'll say is they'll complain about Chinese involvement in Cape Verde. They'll talk about why they don't like it. They'll talk about why they don't like the goods that are being sold. They'll talk about how they are concerned about business opportunities being lost for local Cape Verdeans. And it says a lot that I could just go talk to someone else who's within my diaspora group here in the United States, not tell them I work on China issues, and they just feel the need to talk about it. And that many people in DC would benefit from hearing those opinions, hearing those voices, but unfortunately those voices aren't usually included. So.
Yeah, I would like to echo that. And I guess having also worked in the think tank space here in BC and been surrounded by a lot of these voices, just want to impart to all our listeners that if you're familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, the Dunning-Kruger effect is a psychological effect. The more confident you are, you tend to be more confident in something you don't understand. And I think that it can definitely affect how young professionals see themselves, especially when they come into DC and when they're surrounded by people who have very large institutions backing them, who seem very confident, and just want to impart to people that that essentially you trust yourself. Keep asking questions, but please do trust yourself. Just because someone has a very fancy title behind their name doesn't necessarily mean they know more than you. If what they're saying doesn't resonate, and just because I see a lot of particularly young people at the start of their career coming to DC trying to make a living, trying to get in, and that Bryce, you brought up coming from LA, and you probably heard the saying, DC is Hollywood for ugly people, kind of that coming here to try to make a living and try to make an impact. It's easy to get disheartened early on. And I mean, we're going to do what we can to make that less of a thing for the next generation. But, you know, in the meantime, like you've got this. You deserve every bit of confidence that you have fought and earned for. Don't let anyone tell you. Well, people will try to tell you otherwise, but that doesn't mean they know what they're talking about.
And if I could add to that, the power and the real power in coming from these different ethnic backgrounds, mindsets, etc. If you know how to draw parallels between your lived experiences and insights into foreign policy, I think I would say much like we saw on this panel. We kept talking about our backgrounds and connecting it to American foreign policy and a lot of the different things that we see. That is very unique to you. No one can just come up with these things. So please embrace your background, and don't think you don't have anything to say.
All right, I think that's it.
Okay, if that's it, on behalf of DINSN, we'd like to thank you, Bryce, for moderating, and Shirley and Ann and Rashid for your wonderful input to the discussion this evening. Thank you all so much.